later, and we'll let y'all know how to access that. So just a quick review of what we're going to be covering today in the next hour or less than an hour. So going to doing a little opening framing myself. We're also going to be, and then we're going to hear, basically just pass the mic to our amazing speakers, Trey Vasquez, Stacey Park, Mary Rose Tarouk, and I'm going to give a little more of an introduction for each one of them before they speak. If we have time, we're going to roll through a short Q&A piece of the webinar, and then we'll end with some closing announcements. So that's just a little overview of how this is going to flow. A couple logistical things, just so you know, you are muted, and also this is being recorded, as mentioned, and then also, yeah, and the recording link is going to be made available. If you have questions, also want to share resources, have any ideas that pop in your mind, we encourage you all to put them in the chat box. The way we're going to do the Q&A is kind of is just to collect the questions over the chat box, and then choose questions from there later if we have time. Also want to shout out, we have a couple hashtags to use during this webinar. So if you're able to post either live or right after the webinar about what you're hearing, that'd be dope. Hashtag Wildfires webinar and hashtag Just Transition. And then also please tag MG. We're on all the channels, IG, Facebook, Twitter. Cool. So actually, to get us situated, I'm just going to do a couple minutes of grounding real quick. I just want to invite everybody to just get present, to take a second to sit or do whatever you're doing, wherever you are, whether you're out and about or you're settled in a place, just to get situated and to connect with your breath real quick. I have an image up of the beautiful California coastline. This is Big Sur. So feel free to take that beautiful abundance of Mother Earth and the web of life, beautiful escape. And just to take a second to give yourself some gratitude. Gratitude to you and yourself for being here. Gratitude to the other folks on this webinar, so sending out some love virtually to those who we're connecting with right now. Gratitude and love to those impacted by the wildfires, shutoffs, and the toxic air in California. And also gratitude and love for the land. So go ahead and take, if it feels good for you, take a deep breath in and out. And I welcome you. I welcome you to this webinar. Actually, before I jump into that, I wanted to just share that MG is a political education and strategy organization rooted in ecological justice. For those who aren't super familiar with us, we're based in the Bay Area, and we're hosting this webinar because we found it to be a useful role to provide grounded analysis and to uplift folks who are doing on-the-ground organizing, moving real solutions during these moments of crisis. And so we thought a webinar was the right format this time. Yeah, and you can connect more with us through movementgeneration.org and also just emailing ellen@movementgeneration.org. Like state of the fires, and folks are probably calling in not just from California, or maybe people are calling in from other places. The wildfire crisis is just hella real right now. Right, so I remember like 5 years ago when folks were talking about a wildfire season. That isn't a season anymore, that's actually year round. And that is actually true. We have fires during what's called the wet or the winter season here in Cali. And then particularly in the Bay in the past 3 years since the Tubbs fire in 2017, just massive, devastating, and sometimes deadly for human life wildfires that come with severe air quality conditions in the Central Bay and now power shutoffs. And the biggest, most recent one up here is the Kincaid fire. This is a screenshot from CAL FIRE's website that I took a few hours ago maybe, that it burned over 77,000 acres, and as of today is 80-something% contained, so still burning. Stolen coast, Miwok land, Sonoma County. And just lots of studies, right, about California's wildfires that gotten a lot of worse in terms of acreage and damages, and that 15 of California's 20 largest fires have happened since 2000. Here's a little kind of useful GIF or graphic that's been going around. You can see over time how the fire season has changed. And the top the largest two fires in California's modern history has happened in the last 2 years. We'll let that run. So you can see the top two fires there. Last year, the Mendocino Complex, a huge fire that blazed up north, and then the Ventura Santa Barbara fire, the Thomas fire down south in 2017. And then also I wanted to highlight the Camp Fire that happened in 2018 that burned down the town of Paradise, was the most destructive and deadliest in modern history in California, and that happened last year, right? And so with status quo or business as usual continuing, we also just don't see that changing and possibly getting worse. Okay. Yeah, I can try that. Excuse me while I... Okay, let's try this. Trey or Mary Rose, can you give me a head nod if you can hear me, since I can see you guys? All right, word. Thank you. All right, also, in response to this, to fires, so during periods of high fire risk, namely when wind conditions threaten the transmission lines, shutting off power to different areas, literally less than a day's notice, some folks were scrambling to check power outage maps to see if they would be affected. Schools were closed last minute. An elderly man, Gerald Naimi, actually, who depended on a respirator, died during one of the shutoffs. So that's sort of a state of where we're at in the crisis this year. And so what is behind these massive wildfires, right? Is it PG&E and its power lines? Is it climate change? Is it 376 consecutive months of drought? Is it sprawl of housing development into fire-prone areas? Is it bad land management? Is it centuries of racist, extractive capitalism and colonialism that stole land and sovereignty from Native peoples, put our basic needs into the hands of profit-driven corporations, and systematically exploited the land, our labor, and our livelihoods? I would say it's all of the above, right? And more. And really, the fact that we can't explore the dimensions of the wildfires in isolation of each other. So let's look at the drought. We were officially in a drought for over 7 years, right? Just hella hot, hella dry conditions, and creating what people call in forests. And of course, created by and exacerbated by climate disruption, or what people call climate change, and just changing global climate patterns on a massive scale, driving this extreme heat, lack of rain, big wind patterns. And really, there's, to name, there actually still is lots of dry fuel out there, not a lot of rain predicted. So I think we're also bracing possibly for more fires in the next couple weeks. And also let's talk about talking about that area, the housing crisis and sprawling growth and what people are calling the wildland urban interface, coined by the Forest Service, but basically that outskirt area outside of urban areas between the urban and super rural areas, right? And more folks getting pushed out of the cities, driving the demand for housing outside of the Central Bay. So development is soaring in these outskirts, which just happens to be terrible planning. This is super fire prone area. It's along wind corridors. And actually we don't have good practices or regulations like zoning laws around fire risk for development like we do earthquakes. Speaking of that landscape, people are really talking about PG&E's power lines and being the cause of these fires. And yes, that caused the spark, right? But then let's also talk about the large scale energy infrastructure which requires these long transmission lines spanning across huge areas of dry-ass land mixed with the sprawl, which is already dangerous, right? Versus localized energy systems that aren't managed by corporate greed. And then there's multiple feedback loops that is involved in that. This infrastructure allowing more energy to go out to these sprawl areas, which allows for that building and development where we shouldn't. And then that development is self-demanding more energy. And so we're stuck in that self-reinforced feedback loop. Also calling out the massive polluting facilities, mostly in Black and brown poor communities, creating more climate disruption, right? Which is then exacerbating conditions for fires. And all the while, the web of life and frontline communities getting tossed around in this devastating cycle. And just overall, the mismanagement is clear because the wrong folks are managing, right? So let's talk about native sovereignty, or the stripping of it, and the ignoring of indigenous wisdom. We live in a fire-dependent ecology out here in Cali. Native folks for thousands of years took care of these lands with traditional controlled burning practices. That sovereignty was stripped, and tribes are really just literally not allowed to tend fire in the forests right now. And so instead of that controlled traditional burning, we've had decades of fire repression. And it's the shit show of governing fire management from a colonial mindset at the federal level versus using traditional ecological, local, or bioregional level. So that's the context, the causes kind of behind these fires. But what are the responses of the wildfires? We can't also look at solutions in isolation. They have to be holistic and tied to a longer strategy towards liberation. And at MG, we talk about real solutions as those that don't create new problems or exacerbate existing ones. And we're constantly asking the questions, for and by whom, and towards what? And for that, I look towards the Just Transition framework. For those who aren't familiar, we can offer a link to the zine in the resources that we'll send out after this. But essentially, we're in this extractive economy that is exploiting and oppressing land and life for the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. But we're looking to go towards regenerative economies that are based in principles of sacredness and caring for land and life, and where we're regenerating and honoring our labor, our relationships to each other, and the web of life. Right now, in this moment, we're swimming in the stream of solutions getting thrown at the wildfire crisis, which happens in all moments of shock or crisis, right? But right now, we want to avoid the minefield of potential false solutions. It's so easy to default to solutions that just fuel or get stuck in the extractive economy. So as a basic example, we're hearing more mainstream conversations right now about putting PG&E's power lines underground to mitigate risk. Well, let's think about that. If messing with the web of life is how we got here, excavating hundreds of miles of transmission lines underground doesn't seem like the right call. Not to mention the disrespect of indigenous sovereignty and potential plunder through sacred lands. And really, of course, that would leave the same capitalist corporate interest with the power and control over the situation and our energy systems. PG&E or any corporation that Gavin Newsom decides he wants to hand the utilities over to. Also, this is also laying the groundwork for the eco-apartheid happening. Let's name that. We see Malibu rebuilding and being called a federal disaster zone, while those who are houseless or undocumented are not able to leave, rebuild homes, or escape bad air. The system also creates conditions where prisoners become frontline responders for $1 a day, and Kanye can hire private firefighters. The unequal distribution of resources and power, the class contradictions of this system have become so disrespectfully blatant in this moment of crisis response. But what is the opportunity then? So this huge culture shifting moment is real. Like, folks are clearly identifying this as the new normal. There are big calls not only for rapid response to fire victims, but PG&E is just not in a good place. All kinds of shit now, right? The political context is actually probably different even from a year ago. The calls to end PG&E for public ownership are hella strong. Like, folks want a transformation of our economy and energy systems in a huge way right now. We see the crack in the systems getting bigger and deeply, deeply exposed. And so what is there to do? At MG, we talked about how the transition is inevitable, but justice is not. So how do we ensure a just transition that shifts towards regeneration and liberation, not towards extractivism? And one super, super important question and guiding principle for us is to ask ourselves, who is leading this transition? This must be those who are on the front lines and have been for decades, right? Those on the fence line of polluting power plants, those left behind in FEMA responses because they're undocumented or don't have language access, the disabled and chronically ill folks who depend on a functional energy system to survive and who's impacted first and worst in any climate disaster. We talk about taking over PG&E's system. Who's at the table, right? Who's setting it? We got to make sure it is the front lines. And you're going to hear from those folks today. When we navigate solutions also, right now in this political moment, ecological moment, we have to have a sense of urgency, but we also have to remember that there are no shortcuts. So the frame around urgency or climate emergency can actually be dangerous, right? Because urgency enables desperation, which then can enable false solutions. But understandably, right, this is hella real because the suffering is also hella real and the impacts are unquestionable. But we often end up throwing our weight behind the system despite our recognition of it as the problem. So then we have to make sure that everything we do to be led by and center those on the front lines. Be directly tied to a visionary strategy that takes us out of the extractive economy, moves us towards right relationship with each other and the web of life, and pushes us to practice self-governance. So shifting power right now means putting it into the hands of the people, whether that's mutual aid instead of FEMA or community-controlled local energy systems instead of PG&E. And if we're not prepared to govern, we're not prepared to win. And that takes organizing. So the call is to ask yourself, who are your folks? How are we democratizing the spaces and communities that we're in towards self-governing to meet our needs together? We call this resilience-based organizing, right? Folks talk about wanting to break this quote unquote bystander effect, that the scale of the problem like gets us stuck. To move from watching it happen to putting our labor and love on the line so that our labor and love is no longer fueling the extractive economy. And do that in ways that are visionary and oppositional, contesting for power from the current system and reclaiming it for the people. This is how our solutions don't just perpetuate the status quo, but organize towards real transformation. And also to name, we see this as a protracted long-term struggle, right? So how is our organizing laying the groundwork to be ready for the next opening, for the next crisis that will happen, to build our power to a place where we can take those moments and harness them towards the shifts we need and want? Like, how did 10 plus years of organizing and putting into place community choice energy systems lay the groundwork for the folks working towards public ownership of PG&E to be ready for this moment? How did the incredible organizing in the North Bay of working class migrant folks for years create the ability for those folks then to respond to the wildfires in the transformational way they did? And then lastly, just before introducing our speakers, just want to zoom out from the Bay a little bit and even from the US and name the powerful political moment that we're in globally, right? There's uprisings everywhere. People calling out the status quo of greed, extractivism, class warfare. Young people are putting their bodies and voices on the line for climate action. And of course, this is also in response to gross escalations of control by elites through any means necessary, including Trump. So shout out to those flooding the streets, facing cops, organizing and strategizing, and special shout out on this call to those who are doing the hard work on the ground in response to the wildfire crisis here in California, and deep, deep love and compassion to those who are suffering and impacted by the fires and the shutoffs. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. And I'm gonna introduce our first speaker, Trey Vasquez with the North Bay Organizing Project and Sanación del Pueblo. He's been organizing in the North Bay where many of these fires have occurred and has been in the lead of some badass, visionary and transformational response and recovery work with undocumented and migrant folks. Trey, thank you so much for joining us today, especially knowing you've been hustling super hard in response to the Kincaid fire. So can you let us know what you're seeing on the ground right now in the North Bay in the wake of the fire, and offer more details about what your organizing is looking like up there, offering politicized rapid response led by and for the people?
Cool. Thank you, Ellie. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I just want to give a shout out and thank you to MG for really creating this space for this really important conversation to happen right now as we're experiencing it in real time. And I want to say thank you to the organizers on this call, Mari, Stacey, too, for representing the work that you're doing. Um, I'm gonna do my best today to really speak to what's happening in this moment in a very human way. What I mean by that is a lot of times when we are in crisis and experiencing trauma, we tend to go to our head, right, and to start trying to fix it or feel almost a sense of desperation, like was named earlier. But before being organizers, we're people, we're human beings. And so we're experiencing this moment on all different kinds of levels in terms of mental, physical, emotional, while simultaneously experiencing injustice continue to play out in real time here on the ground as we're in crisis. And acknowledging that this injustice isn't just about right now here in a vacuum, that it's built on a legacy of injustice, a legacy of exploitative policies and corporate greed that has led to this moment to be able to really be in its full power. Um, Despite the fact that they're talking about this as the new normal, the fact that they're talking about we're in a year-round fire season, there's nothing that's ever going to make this feel normal for us as it happens. There's nothing that's going to make it any less devastating or traumatic. Receiving notifications at 3 o'clock in the morning that you need to evacuate your house, pulling up to gas stations where the lines are out onto the street, getting onto gridlock traffic, freeways, watching fires come down the hill. It's a completely scary and shocking experience. And it doesn't make it any easier that it was only 2 years ago that we experienced mostly the same thing. So going off of that, in 2017, we got hit with the Tubbs fire, which burnt about 36,000 acres here, took the lives of 22 individuals, and burnt approximately 5,000 structures, which was about 5% of the housing stock here in Sonoma County. So to find ourselves here again, we're still in a stabilization process from 2017. So here we are again facing a very similar situation. So I want to take a moment to just talk about some of the learnings that came from 2017, while also capturing at the same time it's still shocking. So for folks who are familiar with Sonoma County, we depend largely on tourism as the primary backbone of the economy here. When people think of this area, they think wine country. In fact, 1 out of 10 jobs here are in the tourism or hospitality industry. So how it lives here, how it lives nationally and globally is these industries are able to profit and thrive due to the labor of Black and brown people, due to the labor of women, due to the labor of undocumented people, many of whom here in this county have lost their homes and their livelihood due to the fires, right? So our county is a prime example of how capitalism continues to thrive off of the extraction of land and labor. So much so that we're getting word from our folks who are in the evacuation centers that wineries are sending their people out to pick up workers in the morning and taking them back out into the fields, despite there being mandatory evacuation notices. So again, it's reinforcing that profits are held more valuable than people when it comes to frontlines communities. It was framed here as that there's a 10% harvest left, so exceptions were made. So not only are companies willing to jeopardize their workers' health due to the smoke from the fires, it's a year-round ongoing because folks are exposed to toxic pesticides year-round as well. So this is what is ongoing, like we were talking about, the legacies of injustice, that it's just continuing to happen, but it gets exaggerated in these times of climate crisis, right? So this year had less of an impact on housing in our county and more of an impact on land, which hit the vineyards, right, and impacts people's livelihood, right? But we also know about this year is that more people of color, more frontlines communities, more undocumented people were impacted due to the loss of vineyards, right? So even though housing wasn't directly impacted at such a large scale, it impacts people's ability to pay rent, It impacts people's mental health and stability because when you can't pay rent, you're thinking about where you're going to live, and you're thinking about the displacement of your family and so on and so forth. So we're looking at all the interconnections here as we have been with our work, specifically focused on roots, roof, and refuge. Just to name a little bit of that way that the housing crisis looks here, we saw a 37% rent increase directly in the aftermath of the 2017 fires. And we're still working here on the ground to make sure that renters can be protected. We've been forming a tenants union to protect renters and to organize against developers and greedy landlords so that people can have some type of stability to know that Sonoma County isn't going to be completely whitened in the aftermath of these crises, right? Another thing I want to name in terms of our mutual aid work is UndocuFund, which was created as a collaboration in North Bay Organizing Project, North Bay Jobs with Justice, and the Great Day Labor Center, which have so far raised $6.5 million to be redistributed to undocumented people who, as you all know, are ineligible for FEMA assistance in the aftermath of fires. And speaking about ongoing organizing, we were able to respond as quickly as we were this time around because of the ongoing work that's been happening over the last 2 years. So UndocuFund coordinators and organizers were on the phone as the fires are happening, setting up the next clinic, setting up how to get out to evacuation centers and get folks signed up for assistance so we can move as quickly as possible. Another effort of mutual aid that I want to uplift is the Sanación del Pueblo healing clinics, bringing out practitioners to offer holistic healing treatments to folks who are experiencing high levels of trauma from everything on emotional, mental, physical, spiritual level, the impacts of the smoke. It's been a very beautiful opportunity to bring together a community, right, in terms of reclaiming our labor, in terms of really taking care of each other in a time of crisis, and really knowing that we have the power and the self-organization, self-governance skills to not have to depend on these institutions that are harming our community, because as we know, a lot of harm has happened in evacuation centers due to racism, due to cis-hetero patriarchy, and all the ways that the system connects, and it becomes even more harmful in times of crisis like this. Another thing I want to name is our Rights of Mother Earth work that's happening on the ground to really be working around environmental justice ongoing and confronting these extractive corporations that are here. I also want to uplift our Immigrant Defense Task Force, who created a list of recommendations after the 2017 fires. For those that don't know, notifications in the Tubbs Fire 2017 did not go out in any other language besides English. So entire parts of the population, non-English speaking folks, weren't able to receive critical information to know whether or not they needed to evacuate, whether they could return home, and so on and so forth. So folks have been working tirelessly to create language justice efforts, which were approved, and they're out there on the ground now in evacuation centers, making sure that this work is being done, making sure that folks are being held accountable. I also want to lift up Corazon Healdsburg in Healdsburg, who's acted as a hub primarily to Raza, to undocumented folks, to Spanish-speaking people who in need of assistance and resources. MCUI, Movimiento Cultural de Unión Indígena, who's providing translation for our indigenous folks from the South in the community to make sure that translation is available for them. UndocuFund, as well, KBBF, our local radio station. So folks are really banding together to make sure that support is there for frontlines communities. And I just want to say too, is in terms of ongoing organizing and the importance of it, is that one of the things that we've really also been focused on, in addition to responding and being ready to respond, is public and political education. So that as a community, we're empowered, we're educated about the policies that are in place, about who's in power, what decisions are they making, and how are they going to act when these type of disasters happen, because they're going to continue to happen. And we need to know that we're ready for them at all times, and that we're organized year round and able to work with each other and really practice that self-governance that we're talking about. I'm going to close because I'm about at my time here, but I want to say that lastly, a core value, that we're thinking about in the long-term organizing in our strategy is really remembering that we're not trying to return to Sonoma County how it was pre-fire. That we really want to be thinking about how are we re-envisioning, how are we remembering a way of being in good relationship with each other and being in good relationship with the land, with the water and resources that's regenerative. Because these kinds of climate disasters are absolutely avoidable. Yes, the change is inevitable, but there are corporations and people in power that are directly responsible for this happening. And we need to know that, and we need to figure out how we reimagine how we are. And that's the work that we're doing here on the ground. So I'm going to say that there's a list of resources that's going to give you all contact information for the organizations that were named here. If you're able to support, we would love that. We need that. And just so much love and respect out there to each of you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Trey, for breaking it down, for the hard work you all are doing up there and have been doing for many years. Appreciate you. And mad love to the folks in your community. Next up, we're going to jump to our homie and comrade, Stacey Park, from the Disability Justice Culture Club. Stacey's been a disability justice organizer for years. And when the PG&E shutoff started happening earlier last month, began doing some of the most powerful mutual aid organizing for disabled, chronically ill, fat, and elderly folks who depend on Power to Live. Stacey, thank you so much for joining us. Can you share the story of how y'all started responding to the shutoffs and also how you see the mutual aid y'all are organizing as a political act?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And definitely want to echo Trey's gratitude for MG. And want to also shout out Sins Invalid, who I know has been doing a long time work with movement generation and also a lot of the early thinking around disability and the climate crisis. You can check out their work at sinsinvalid.org. So I'm involved with a formation that we've been calling ourselves Power to Live, hashtag Power to Live, and we got started last Friday when there was going to be news of the shutoff again this week or last week, I guess. And a lot of people, and it was a decentralized formation, but a lot of the people in the group had relationships that were 20, 30 years with one another and very much aware that if there's a crisis that they would be the ones keeping each other alive. And it felt like every time, this was already the third shutoff that's happened, and every time we've witnessed that if it's not going to be disabled people and elders intervening for each other, that the system doesn't have us. And just kind of reconciling with that. That's information we all have. I think marginalized communities have every day about how violent the system is, and I think understanding or the scale of how much we have to look out for each other is sometimes a little bit overwhelming when we think about the climate crisis. And so a lot of the folks in the group, the first time the shutdown went out, we had been calling around and checking on each other and offering housing and helping people get battery packs. And there was a spreadsheet going around where over 230 people had completed that they were available to offer support. But the difficulty about that public spreadsheet is then when places like the New York Times are linking to it, then all of people's private information is available online and makes it really easy to get doxxed. And then I think doesn't take into the account of how much labor it is to actually sit down and look for resources when you are already in a crisis. And so we set it up where there was 2 different forms. So if you need support and you're in the East Bay, then you complete a Google form and you let us know where you are and what kind of support you're needing and what are your access needs. And then we would have a team of people watching that form and watching that phone number. And then that team would have somebody on shift and rotations and reach out to the person that needs support and talk with them about what are they needing and kind of triaging it. And then we had another team and another form where if you had a resource to offer, then you complete that form. So, for example, a lot of people, last week when the power shut off before the governor announced that it was a state of emergency, all the local hotels were price gouging. And so a hotel that might usually be $150, they were charging $1,200, $600, all of these things. And so it's impossible to get a hotel room that way. And then even after the emergency, all, impossible to find places to stay. So we were connecting people with housing, figuring out where we could source generators and batteries in the Bay Area where they're all sold out, where propane is sold out, and then how to get it to people. We were sealing up the windows and doors for people that can't be exposed to the smoke. We were helping pass out masks, doing all of that kind of work, and we supported 32 different families, disabled families, a lot of times who are multi-generational and multi-disabled. And since then, we're kind of figuring out what is going to be the mutual aid effort in the East Bay going forward. And so, for example, what can we do to support more people learning about how to put together a box fan purifier, for example? Or what can we do to support people and develop individual or neighborhood plans? Again, knowing that when push comes to shove, it's really us looking out for ourselves. So that's the work we're doing right now. The people that are involved, we're all just grassroots activists, individual type folks. We found that a lot of the local nonprofit structure that would maybe like to think that they were in place to support our communities, the reality is just nonprofit industrial complex is not often set up to respond really quickly. And if it's a Friday afternoon when all the nonprofits are closed, there was no information available over the weekends and nobody people can get in touch with. And I think, again, just speaks to the need to support communities in self-governing for themselves and that communities know what they need. We were doing things like writing a survival guide so people can figure out how much battery power their ventilator or oxygen concentrator needs, or if the power goes out, how long will their oxygen last? For one person, it was 4 hours. So we had a plan that if her power goes out, she calls us right away. And we had a wheelchair accessible ride set up for her and a place for her to go and all of that. That all, definitely takes a lot of planning. So we've been doing a lot of fundraising around that, and that's available on our Facebook. If you just search hashtag Power to Live, there's a couple different fundraisers that will pop up. We approached, actually, not so ironically, we approached PG&E for funding because one battery for one house costs $3,000. And that's PG. I mean, to us, we think of this as like PG needs to be paying for this. And so we approached executives there, and they offered us about 10% of what was requested, enough just to buy one battery. So I just feel like that just speaks to the disregard that they have for vulnerable people. They are aware of people in their service base who are medical baseline customers, so people who have medical need for electricity and just have no plan in place for people and don't even feel like they're even sorry or going to acknowledge that. So we're looking to do more work within ecological justice and climate justice movement to better understand how to support disabled people. I think just for my own self, I'm really sitting with the reckoning that like to love disabled people and love elders is to care about the climate crisis, and needing to really skill up. Learning about generators and batteries is kind of like the last thing I'm interested in, but apparently like that's what we need to know now to survive. And so just really thinking about how do our everyday responsibilities change so we can really be prepared to support our neighbors and friends. I think that's all I have. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you, Stacey, so much. That's just really powerful, like super rapid response organizing you guys were doing, calling in a lot of people. I just imagine also the folks who you mobilized, whether they're disabled or not, through your efforts, and just appreciate all the work you're doing. We're going to be sharing, or Michelle's actually been sharing all the links that you were just mentioning over the chat box, but also we'll aggregate them and send them out together. and also just excited for our budding political partnership between your communities and movement generation and climate justice movement. So mad love there. So last but not least, going to introduce our last speaker, who is Mary Rose Tarouk, who is the coordinator of the California Utility Justice Campaign, which is housed at the local Clean Energy Alliance. They've been doing organizing around energy democracy for years, and are now organizing towards a public takeover of PG&E, which she'll talk about more. Mary Rose, can you tell us about the campaign and also how y'all are seeing this, the situation with PG&E and the public takeover as a strategy towards just transition?
Hi, everybody. I'm so honored to be here, and I'm heartened by the work of Trey and the North Bay Organizing Project, and Stacey and the Disability Culture Club and Movement Generation. I think about in these times of the changing terrain and the climate crisis, how I hold my sheroes and heroes close to my heart and lift you up even more, because I know that I'm doing this work in a certain place, and know that and trust that you all are doing your work in your communities, and that all together that we're pushing through. So thank you, everybody, for that. So I just got hired for this new campaign that's so timely. This utility justice campaign that really takes the leadership of frontline communities to be able to say what we need in these times of the failures of PG&E as part of this broader dynamic. I think that we should welcome that the fossil fuel infrastructure that we've had for over 100 years is crumbling, and that we need to be able to replace it with the vision and the needs that we have as a community, and that we need to prepare ourselves to be ready to govern in that opening. Right. And so the Utility Justice Campaign and our leadership team is trying to do just that in this crisis of PG&E and this private utility that cares much more about the paying out their shareholders than public safety when they shut off power to medically vulnerable folks, folks on breathing machines, etc. So the Utility Justice Campaign centers our solutions in frontline communities, and that whatever solutions that we're going to push forward, it has to work for those who are most impacted and those who are most vulnerable. And that the principles of environmental justice that we speak for ourselves still ring true, that you know, we're hearing a lot of ideas in the landscape for how we should be restructuring PG&E or what we should be doing. But really, the people who are most impacted by the fires and the shutoffs and our dirty energy system need to be at the table to be able to push forward the vision and what we implement in the future. The 4 legs of our Utility Justice Campaign are that we oppose the billion-dollar bailouts that are going to PG&E. That 2, we move towards public ownership of this private utility. And PG&E's territory covers the northern half of the state of California. So it's probably the biggest utility in the country. So to move into public ownership of that would be big and beautiful. 3, we want to restructure our energy system so that we move towards the just transition vision that we have. And 4, all of this, our energy system has to be adaptive and resilient for our communities in this climate crisis. And so holding those parts of the campaign we are still brand new, and we haven't even officially launched. Maybe this webinar is part of our launch. So hey, we have a utility justice campaign, and our leadership team met for the first time last week. A bunch of environmental justice groups that are leading the charge in California around energy justice and environmental and climate justice. Folks in the energy democracy field. Folks who are allies in shaping just transition for California and beyond. And so one of the things that we're seeing in the landscape is that there's a lot going on. And so even our approach to organizing, and I've helped to coordinate quite a few statewide and regional coalitions for the EJ movement. And one of the things that I'm seeing now is that there's, with fast changes happening in our landscape, yes, we center on frontline communities. Yes, our leadership is by frontline communities, and there's a lot of change happening. So how can we be nimble in how we approach the solutions, and how do we find the openings in the landscape for our vision to actually take root and grow? And so there's an intricate dance that we're doing around being responsive to the opportunities. So for instance, when Governor Newsom says, oh, we could replace PG&E, this dirty corporation, with another dirty corporation by Warren Buffett. It's like, come on, that's ridiculous. The reason why the problems exist with PG&E setting fires onto communities and shutting off power to our vulnerable neighbors is because they just care about their profits and not about public safety or the community or the people and kids who are being poisoned in our communities. And so it's offensive that the governor would even propose that. So then on Friday, the governor also said he's going to establish an energy czar, or anoint an energy czar, and that there are going to be a couple tables, a couple plans to test out. One is, his first choice is that PG&E's shareholders and some Wall Street investors and maybe some fire victims would be at a table trying to figure out what to do with PG&E. So that's one. And if that fails, then maybe plan B. And plan B is restructuring PG&E. And so we want our frontline communities and the leadership of our campaign and environmental justice leaders in the state who have been doing decades of groundwork around how to take care of our communities, not just in terms of energy, but in terms of toxic waste and climate programs, water programs for our communities, that we have to be at the table when we're deciding how to imagine a new way of doing for a major part of infrastructure for our state and where we live. And so so things that we're trying to do within the within our campaign is also, it's like, what do we have under PG&E, under this private utility, and then what is our vision? And so part of the exploration that we need to take on is, so is energy a commodity or a shared resource? And we want it to be more of a shared resource, so that because we're seeing that energy is not just something we buy, it's something that we actually need to live, some of us more so than others. This model of energy where it's centralized by a single private corporation, that's no longer going to work in what we're seeing in the future. And so decentralization ideas are welcome right now, but decentralization in terms of, but still being connected to each other and taking care of communities that need it. And so how do we do that? So it goes on, like from distribution to transmission of our energy, ownership, the jobs, the decision-making, like all of that is going to factor into how we reimagine a new energy system that will work for frontline communities. And so what's important is that even though we might know some things right now, there's a lot that we don't know, but we need to be at the decision-making tables to be able to continue to engage in the conversation, so that our communities and frontline communities are always at the center of the conversation. And I was telling somebody today, one of my favorite stories from climate policy in California is previous Governor Brown said one time a couple of years ago, as he was trying to pass a big climate policy that required 2/3 of the legislative vote, is that he couldn't get his big climate policy passed without those damn environmental justice folks needing to be in the room. So I cheer us on to continue that kind of organizing and that kind of presence in our state capital and where decisions are being made. And that's the spirit that we're taking this utility justice campaign in and forward.
Hey, thank you so much, Mary Rose. Congratulations on your soft launch of the campaign. We're all here for it, supporting y'all. We'll call it a rolling launch. We look forward to a party sometime soon. But yeah, congratulations on that campaign, which, you know, just to also emphasize, y'all are launching in this moment, but have been building it before this year's fires, right? And over years of work. So shout out to that. Thank you so much. We have a couple minutes left on this webinar. We actually haven't gotten any big questions or any questions, I think, over the chat box directly from folks who are listening in. But I did, since we have a couple minutes before I get to announcements, do you all, this panelists, I'm going to give you a minute. Do you want to shout out any specific things, that announcements, places to go? You know, we'll share all the links that you all shared, but anything you want to say in person or virtually, not in person. Right now, go ahead. You can just jump in, unmute yourself.
Oh, well, folks are coming up with questions. One plug is that when I talked about this the governor's table for reimagining what we have under PG&E, our utility justice campaign, probably with the California Environmental Justice Alliance, is going to have send a letter to the governor. And so one way our allies can support is to support the call for frontline communities to be at these decision-making tables. So when that letter is ready, we'll send it out to you all.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. We will. Trey or Stacey, anything you guys want to add before we close out?
I'll just yeah, re-emphasize for folks who are looking to support in any way possible from whatever distance that you're at, to just check out the resource list that was posted in the chat box for folks who are not only working with frontlines communities, but many of whom represent the frontlines communities that they're in here in the North Bay. So just want to put that out there to folks.
Thank you. There's a question first. Maybe say more about how you organize for mutual aid examples.
I'm going to jump to Stacey, if you have anything, Stacey, and then we're just going to close out. I think we can, sharing some of the links, I think will help with that question too.
I mean, the biggest thing I think about mutual aid is that it's all dependent on relationships. And so it makes sense to be doing that kind of planning when there's not a crisis. So reaching out to neighbors, even if you're shy, or asking your, comrades and colleagues, like what they're going to need in a crisis and getting a plan in place. That seems like the biggest start. And then I heard a question around what are the asks of PG&E and all of that. And we're finding here that it's surprising that people don't still think it's an issue around even basic things like, people need power to live, and there's going to be people that die if you turn it off. And so I think just kind of reiterating the impact of this on frontline communities and asking like how people are at being invited to the table or not, and making sure that we're fighting for real solutions. All is good starting places. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you everybody for joining today's webinar. Really honored to be in this conversation and doing this work. Just a reminder, we are recording this. The link will be sent out. If you registered, we can also post that on social medias. So the link to this recording will be made available. A resources page will also be made available so you can stay in connection and support all these folks doing badass work. So thank you all. Shout out to everybody. I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. And thank you.